Hey guys, welcome to another edition of my podcast and to another edition of Grant's podcast, because this is actually going to be a podcast sure. So Professor Grant Schofield from New Zealand is joining us. Grant, hello.
Hey, Paul, and thanks for being a guest on Precure.com's podcast series as well. So great to share the love here.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And this came because we were just having a conversation last week about COVID, and particularly in the light of the advice that the UK government has now got from all the scientists advising it, saying essentially everybody is going to be exposed to COVID eventually. So when we discussed that, it kind of brought up the idea of the elephant in the room here, right? So everything here in that's coming out from all of the health is all about vaccination, with very good reason, right? Because it reduces your risk of death quite significantly. And I'm sure it's the same in New Zealand. It's all about the vaccination. But given that with this new information that everybody's eventually going to be exposed to it, we want to address what is to this point being the elephant in the room. What can we do from a lifestyle perspective to minimize the severity when we are exposed to it?
I think you've got a good point there. Let's just reiterate that especially where we live in New Zealand, and you, Paul, in Victoria and Australia, we've had this sort of lockdown mentality, and I guess in some ways that has bought some time for people to prepare and get a vaccine. I've gone and done that myself. I think those sorts of medical decisions, people will make those themselves on the basis of what they see the risk and benefits are, and those are their medical decisions. I've decided to do it, and I think for me that the benefit outweighs the risk, particularly with even though I've got a pretty healthy profile, it's still worth it. But we just haven't talked about it. It hasn't been a topic. Health and metabolic health, and I think when you start to look at some of the statistics on this, it's actually interesting that 40% of all COVID deaths are people with diabetes. If you are a diabetic and you're admitted to hospital, you've got a 1 in 5 chance of being dead within 28 days. And these are scary statistics. And you sort of look at the other comorbidities that predict poor outcomes. They're metabolic, around insulin resistance, around pre-diabetes, around frank presentation of diabetes, or they are other metabolic syndrome factors, which are all clustering around that. So when you talk about hypertension or dyslipidemia or high waist circumference, we're talking about the same causal means. And you make a really great point there about the UK has got there, and they've said, actually, guys, we're all going to get this, which we are. So what are you going to do, and what are we going to do as a society around this? Because actually, and it's not just COVID, because the exact same things are going to give you a longer, healthier life. It's going to increase your health span. It's going to mean you have a better time when you're on the planet, and you're going to save your country money if that's what you have some care about. But you're gonna be there for your grandkids. You're going to be functional. So it's the exact same thing, and that's what I think we should be investing our time and money in, over and above what we've already done now.
Yeah, and look, before we get into all of the mechanisms around it, I'll just share a couple of other statistics, right? So there was a paper released this year on more than 48,000 patients looking at physical activity and COVID outcomes. And what they found is that people who are sedentary have more than twice the risk of being hospitalized if they catch COVID from people who meet the guidelines of 150 minutes a week. And they have almost double the risk of ending up in ICU, and they've got 2.5 times the risk of dying versus somebody who's meeting those guidelines. And then another one that we're going to dive into in some depth is vitamin D. And there was a 2020 study. There was only 185 patients, but it's a reasonable sample size. And they found that those who were vitamin D deficient, they had a 6-fold increase of severe disease and a 15-fold increased risk of death
Wow.
when they had low vitamin D. And here's the thing. 30% of Australians, I'm not sure about the data in New Zealand, I'm sure it's very similar, at least 30% of Australians are vitamin D deficient, right? And when you take into account 2/3 of the population in Australia and in New Zealand are either overweight or obese, and that there's high rates of diabetes and metabolic syndrome, lots of people are in serious trouble. And I actually had a conversation with a friend of mine who is quite anti the vaccination, not massively, but just didn't really want to get it. And I said to him, I won't say his name, I said, mate, because I knew he's a bit overweight, and I said, what's your BMI? And we had a conversation about that. And it's like, he's obese, right? And I said, what's your blood sugar like? And he said, oh, I'll have to go and check because I just went to the docs. And he's got high place pre-diabetic and blood sugar. I said, mate, go and get the bloody vaccine. And here's some lifestyle stuff that you can do as well, right? So this is the stuff that nobody is talking about. And look, from one perspective, I get it, right? Because the chief health officers have got to know this stuff, but they probably don't want to dilute the message, right? They're just saying, like, it's now all about, let's get as many people vaccinated as possible. And then they'll probably go and talk about the other stuff that you can do. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But I think that me and you, both knowing this and both being very pro-lifestyle, I think this is a very important podcast.
Well, I'm not sure they will get there. Let's really hope they do. I think part of my frustration, and I know yours, with the medical model as it stands, is it's very good at looking at pathology and then sickness and dealing with those symptoms. And this is what we're seeing at the moment. Again, is just simply a following of that model. And so, before COVID came, the major burdens of disease were still metabolic, and we were doing very little about it.
Yeah.
And I sort of feel that in both, well, around the world, really, but, from where I know the expenditure very well, which is Australia and New Zealand, when we spend just a small decimal point of our health budget on lifestyle and preventive medicine, if we could get a shift to something that was a little bit more reasonable, say we just got up to, $1 in $10 that we spent in the health system on this, imagine the completely different state that we'd be in.
Yeah, absolutely. So this very much, I think my listeners probably heard me talk about it, primary and secondary prevention, and then tertiary. So basically, tertiary is where you wait until people are screwed and then you put them in the hospital system or you give them drugs, right? Primary prevention is lifestyle education to help you stop getting a disease or a condition. And secondary is lifestyle education to help you to manage it. Now with COVID...
Well, even reverse it though, reverse it.
Or reverse, yes, yeah. Manage or reverse, yeah, good, very good point. Now with COVID, if you have some of those comorbidities, even getting into secondary prevention is a risky strategy, right? Because as you said, you got diabetes, there's a big chance that you're dead within 28 days. And that's not a lot of time to do something about this. So the primary prevention, I think, is where this is really targeted around COVID. So let's kick off and talk about the research paper that you sent me a few weeks ago around blood sugar and COVID-19. Can you just take us through that?
Well, so this is a paper published in Frontiers in Public Health, and it's data-based, but it relies more on, it looks at the mechanisms. We'll get into the epidemiology after that. But the question is, if you've got diabetes or problems managing your blood sugar, why is that a problem? At what point is it along a virus coming in and setting up in your lungs and invading your cells? Is it a problem? And the answer is surprising. At every point of this viral problem, even pre-getting the virus, things are going on. So when you've got elevated blood glucose, you've got an impaired immune system at two levels. First of all, when glucose and insulin are constantly high, there's a failure of this endogenous ability to produce antioxidants and reduce oxidative stress and inflammation. So this is sort of idea of periodic fasting. We'll be able to produce ketones then you've got an endogenous immune system really helping mop up these excess free radicals and the inflammatory problems. You've also got an impaired response, because the problem is that the innate immune system response is inflammation, right? So being not inflamed and then having this rapid increase in immune response, inflammation is what.
Oh, I actually, I'm just going to jump in here. Case in point is me sitting right now on my new hip, right? So I am 6 days in from a hip resurfacing, and there's massive inflammation going through my body, right? A huge inflammatory response, but that is an important part of the healing process, isn't it? Is that there's an insult to the body, and then the body just activates all these inflammatory molecules that go and activate your immune system to try and deal with the insult, whether that insult is a virus or whether it's physical trauma, like in my condition. That inflammatory response, that quick upregulation of inflammation, is really important all across the board, isn't it?
It's crucial, and I think there's some really instructive, interesting points that happen around there. So you often, and I think they're still giving this. I don't know if they gave this to you post surgery, but ice and get this inflammation down. And I think that actually might be a good idea if you've already got chronic inflammation, because you're adding your extra inflammation on top of the other inflammation you've got, actually an out of control problem. But for someone who's metabolically healthy like you, I think the evidence is starting to mount up that icing injuries and post-surgically is actually a bad idea, which is fascinating, right? Because we've been told the opposite. And then we've seen that in high-intensity exercise as well, that ice baths and antioxidant-rich foods post a very high-intensity workout dulls the response.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because of that inflammation, that acute inflammatory effect is 100% sought after. That's what we want. That's how we build better. And the last one that I've just been looking at, actually, which flabbergasted me, you watch this Wim Hof stuff with the breathing in the ice, and you're like, okay, it's slightly on the edge. But the clinical trial he was involved with, where they had 20 subjects, they randomized 10 to, all 20 were injected with an endotoxin. This is going to give them cold and flu-like symptoms. And one,
it was E. coli, wasn't it? It was E. coli.
Yeah. So, it's not going to be fatal or anything, but it's still nice. And the one group that did his breathing method, and the part of the Wim Hof breathing method seems completely counterintuitive. You hyperventilate, and you stimulate your sympathetic nervous system, and you get a quick inflammatory response, which activates the innate immune system. The net effect of that is that those 10 really never got symptoms from that endotoxin. And the group that didn't do that got quite a lot of symptoms, and sort of counterintuitively, but I guess what you'd expect is that in the end they had a much higher level of inflammation. So the breathing group was able to produce the inflammation quickly and deal with the problem, and the other group wasn't able to do that, but then ended up getting the sort of cytokine storm that they had to do to deal with it, and had a lot of symptoms. Because the symptoms are the cytokine storm, right? That's the prolonged inflammation.
Vic, can I tell you a funny story on this? Last week when I was in hospital, I think it was day one after my surgery or something like that. So they doing your OBS, and maybe it was even the night of the surgery. They're doing your OBS observations. So they're coming and taking your blood pressure, and they're looking at your heart rate and your oxygen saturation, right? And there was a point where my oxygen saturation dropped down to, I think it was 92. And the nurse was like, oh, that might be a little bit of a concern. And I said, okay, what's this? And I did 30 Wim Hof breaths, and she's kind of looking at me going, and I said, look, it's okay. I've done this heaps of time. So I did 30 controlled hyperventilation, and my oxygen saturation hit 100%. She did not quite know what to make of it. But when I got home on Saturday, I actually started to get a low-grade fever. So I did 4 rounds of the breathing rather than taking any medication. And it worked a treat, right? So I'm a big fan of that stuff. But anyway, we digress.
So no, that's interesting. So so people who don't sort of get what's going on there, you're blowing off
carbon dioxide, and you're bringing in heaps of oxygen, and then you're blowing off carbon dioxide. And so your oxygen saturation actually goes up. So it was quite a cool little experiment to do, but I think I freaked her out.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That's really cool. So where were we with that? We've sort of got to the point.
We were talking about the importance of that acute inflammatory response.
Oh, yeah. So that's just a normal thing, and it's dulled when your insulin and glucose are high. And we talked about those scary stats with having diabetes, and then you talked about your mate with pre-diabetes. Well, no matter how much insulin he produces, he can no longer get normal glucose homeostasis. And we call that, for some reason, unbeknownst to me, we call that pre-diabetes, like it's pre-disease, where it's decades into a chronic progression of something starting with insulin resistance and then hyper-secreting of insulin, hyperinsulinemia, and then even with hyperinsulinemia, which is inflammatory anabolic hormone, it's now chronically high. Now you can't control your blood glucose. Now you've got pre-diabetes. It's not, you're actually pre-nothing. So it's interesting how that language even evolves.
Yeah, you're in, and this is the thing, it's arbitrary cutoffs, isn't it? But you are well into metabolic dysregulation. And I remember once talking to, it was one of my PhD supervisors when I was doing something different. And she said to me, we were talking about metabolic syndrome. And she said, when you're looking at metabolic syndrome, often blood glucose is the last thing to go. So people will be overweight. They will have a high waist circumference. Their triglycerides will be high. They'll have high blood pressure, but their blood glucose might be okay. And they're going, yeah, I'm not too bad. And then when that goes, and that's the kind of last thing, and you are right there in metabolic mayhem. And that's part of this whole COVID outcomes and the comorbidities, isn't it? It's just the body's ability to fight stuff off is massively compromised when you have those metabolic comorbidities.
Yeah, that delayed but overreactive inflammation on top of existing inflammation, that cytokine storm, the ability for the virus to replicate more readily and for that load to go up and therefore exacerbate the problem, the ability for epithelial and other tissue damage to happen, the problem around blood clotting and microbleeds. It's just one leads to another, and they all reinforce each other. And that's just something. I mean, the thing is about it, it's like, it all sounds very scary, but there's some pretty simple messages you go, because it's like, you talk about secondary care, you've got glucose out of control, you've got metabolic syndrome. It's, most of the time it's a reversible condition. And I wonder why we've never talked about it as such. It's a reversible thing.
Yeah.
And quickly.
And you've seen it happen quickly. I mean, you've had a number of people go through your programs. I've seen it happen quickly. I've actually seen it happen very quickly with my own mother. So I'm going to tell a personal story here. She arrived in Australia, it was a number of years ago. She was well over, a little bit over 100 kilos, and she's not very tall. So, and she had diabetes. She'd had chronic blood pressure for issues for 40 years. And me and my dad had been conspiring, and she got off the plane and I said to her, "Welcome to Camp Taylor." Right. And she got back on the plane 3 months later, 20 kilos lighter, off her diabetes medication and off her blood pressure medication, right? That was a number of years ago. And she's sort of adhered to the diet. And she, the treatment was a very low carbohydrate, protein rich, fat rich diet of natural foods. And the change, the speed of the change was remarkable, right? And she went home, she maintained it. Then went off it a little bit, and her blood sugar went up again. And then she went, okay, I need to get back on it. So she's back on it. And now she's under 70 kilos for the first time that she can remember, right? Which is pretty cool. And you've had a whole heap of people go through your programs where they have successfully managed their either pre-diabetes or diabetes. Isn't that right?
Yeah, no, first of all, that's remarkable for. I think that's great. But I think you make another good point there, which I think we fail. We somehow with lifestyle, we think is that if you get it right the first time, that's great. But if you relapse, it's a problem. And I think what we should talk about is that relapse with exercise and diet is a completely normal thing.
Yeah.
Consider with smoking cessation, you need, I don't know, 8 attempts or something to get a successful quit.
Yeah.
Then you try, you get some success with eating one way and you drift back in a pathological environment. You try again, you drift back. Yeah, it's a process and a journey. And so I think I'm most proud of the people that didn't get immediate success. They got a bit of success. They fell off the wagon on their third attempt or their fourth attempt. They actually managed to reverse their diabetes. Like, that's pretty cool, right? And so I'm starting to think more like that now than I used to. So, like, hey, here's your chance, have a go at it. Oh, we failed. No, there's multiple chances here, and society is conspiring against you, to get in shape, get your glucose under control. At every point you turn to, there's cheap, ultra-processed food everywhere. I think you and I were talking recently about what you see in kids' diets in our two countries. And you had a statistic, I think, about true here that was just under 70% is what we call ultra-processed food.
Yeah. Recent study showed that 67% of kids' food intake is ultra-processed foods. Now, for me, that it's bloody criminal, right? And a lot of people don't understand, Grant. I think we're in a tangent here, but calories aren't equal. This is the thing, is that, and there was a landmark study, I can't remember who did it, where they took people in, and it was a randomized controlled trial. They put them on 2 different diets, which were isocaloric, same fat, but what they did was they gave them exposure to this ad libitum. So they said, right, you eat as much as you need to feel that you are satisfied. And they did 2 weeks, and the other half of the group was on the other diet. So they had a diet that was healthy, natural foods. The other one was ultra processed. And then they swapped over, right? Which is the beautiful, as me and you know, that's that beautiful design, that randomized crossover design where both people do the different things. And in both cases, when they ended up on that diet, the ultra processed food, they ate 500 calories a day more on average, right? And they showed, this is the thing, they measured a whole heap of hormones that were going on and hormones that affected feeding behavior like ghrelin and things like that. And what has been shown now over and over again is that this cheap ultra processed food, which most of it is high glycemic index carbohydrates, not exclusively, but lots of it, it actually influences the hormones that drive feeding behavior in the brain, right? And the calories, because they are more, they've gone through more processing, they are easier digested in the body. And so you end up putting on weight. But that just really underscores that point where you said that society is conspiring against us because this food is everywhere and it's highly palatable. It often has fat and sugar and salt. And those 3 things are the neurobiology of preference, the stuff that your brain is wired to actually to feel rewarding, because when you live in an environment where there's low energy, it's good to have fat because fat is actually energy dense. It's good to have glucose because it's direct energy, and it's good to have salt because it's necessary for survival. But in these ultra-processed foods, they layer it over, right? And I've challenged people over and over again. Find me something in nature that has significant amounts of fat and sugar, right? But you go and you have a McDonald's burger, it has fat, sugar, and salt layered, right? And it's just, it is a nuclear reward for the brain. Not just those, but those ultra-processed foods hijack your brain, right? And we are digressing slightly here, but I think I really wanted to underscore that point, that to explain what you said when you said society is conspiring against us. And as well as that.
But the closest food I got to, I reckon in nature, and it's not really in nature, that has a significant amount of carbohydrate and fat are cashew nuts. And that's about the only one that I can think of. And they are quite Moorish, right? That's the one.
Yeah.
Stop eating is you start with salted cashew nuts. Good luck with that one. Well, at least for me.
Yeah.
I don't know about anyone else.
Yeah. Well, particularly add the salted cashew nuts. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. And then you get all that. You get quite a lot of argument in academia around is food is the major problem for obesity and metabolic problems? Is it a problem of addiction in the mesolimbic system, the dopamine stuff like you talked about it? Is it a problem of metabolic dysregulation of the vagal nerve and energy out? Is it a problem of dysregulation of hormones and leptin and ghrelin and all those sort of things? And I think the answer is all of them. That it's all going on. We're hardwired to store fat easily because of the brain size that we have. To maintain that brain in a famine is one of our primary survival mechanisms, and so we're still trying to prepare our bodies to help our brain survive for the next famine, which, so far as I can tell, is not coming. And but then also, let's get back to the COVID stuff, because that's the problem, really, isn't it? That we've been designed to have quite specific responses to environmental challenges like pathogens, viruses, and whatnot. I would sort of laugh when I see we have this contactless takeaways and this, that to avoid each other. I mean, if people could actually somehow you could see the viruses, bacteria, fungi that are actually in the world on you, on the coffee cart. Yeah, I mean, honestly, the world is overrun by billions and billions and billions of these microorganisms. It was like a square centimeter of seawater. It's something like a million microorganisms of bacteria and viruses in it. It's like, wow, you're not going to escape these things. So we're highly tuned to operate and deal with these. But when we're not metabolically healthy and the normal acute problem is now, it's not a problem. The acute activation of the immune system is now chronically activated. Then you try and activate your immune system over top of that. Good luck with that.
Yeah. That's the issue. So on your point of the world conspiring against us, I think that brings in another issue, and that is the lack of physical activity. So we mentioned the stats before. So more than double the risk of you ending up in hospital if you are sedentary versus somebody who's meeting the guidelines, and 2.5 times the risk of dying. And the world is basically set up so that we don't need to move very much, right? We have jobs where we sit on our arses all day long. You don't even have to get up. Do you ever happen to get up and change the television or get up and close the blinds, right? And so now you actually sit there and you can call, you get delivered whatever food you want, right? But this is the point. This lack of physical activity is a significant problem. And I think that there's a quote that I quote all the time by Professor Frank Booth, who said the current human genome, he says, has not changed in over 45,000 years, and it requires and expects us to be highly physically active for normal functioning. So let's unpack why being physically active is important for overall metabolic health, but why it is protective against COVID. Obviously, they're linked. So what is it about physical activity that is good for our metabolic health?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that's a great summary. I'm always surprised that the lack of priority that is given to being active, given how, as you say, and I like both stuff, how crucial it is to the human condition. And then the question is, why is it so protective? Because forget immune response and COVID and protection there. It just adds 10 quality life years to your life. So that basis is the best medicine ever invented. Yeah. And then you go, well, why is that? What is the mechanism? And there's been a lot actually around a big fit and your heart's healthy and all that sort of stuff. I think primarily the most important effect of regular activity is that it confers insulin sensitivity and lowers blood glucose. And that hasn't been discussed, really. And the fitter you get and the more you can engage in a decent amount of both high intensity and then low intensity volume activity, then you go another step beyond glucose lowering and allow a range of metabolic signals that are fast. I call it fasting mimicking exercise. It's exactly the same signaling you get when you're getting faster. You hear about fasting mimicking diets and just fasting in general. That you lower glucose, you lower insulin, you allow signaling from things like beta hydroxybutyrate in the blood, and you've got the body just now starting to ramp up its production of this disinhibition of the histodecetylase system. So you're now getting your own antioxidants. You've got a profoundly anti-inflammatory catabolic environment. It's exactly what you want, because now if you do need to have an immune response, it'll work. It's not inflammation on inflammation, and everything else that goes with glucose, right? So glycated end products and advanced like glycated end products and every other bit of tissue damage and inflammation goes on. So we're sort of stuck about half healthy bits of fitness. And I guess that's important, but activity is profoundly metabolic. And actually, then it's an interesting thing, right? I don't know what you think about this, but how do you do public health messages? It's like, well, do you go for the lowest possible thing and say, okay, 30 minutes is enough, but the couch potatoes, that'll get moving. And I agree that's a good message, but it's not the optimal dose. It's not information about optimal doses. What do you reckon about that?
Yeah, look, I agree. And look, when it's optimal, there's a little bit, there's a fair bit of personalization in it, but I like to think about the different types of physical activity. And there's a good mate of mine, Michelle Dalcour, who was on a podcast, who has this really nice model where he's got exercise quadrants on intensity and exercise type, right? So he's got, there's low intensity interval stuff, which is just activities of daily living, getting up your arse, to go and do something in the house, or to just do a bit of gardening, or to walk to the shops. It's low intensity, it's intermittent, right? And we need to do lots of that. And our ancestors did bucket loads of that, right? And I think that's one of the major issues, is that we're just not stimulating our metabolism enough with that sort of stuff. And when you sit, there's massive changes in gene expression, all that. But then there's another quadrant, which we would typically call cardio, right? Which is that lower intensity, steady state stuff. And it's important that we do some of that because of all the things that you mentioned around that antioxidant production, anti-inflammatory. And then when you get into the higher intensity, there's actually a bit of nuance under high intensity stuff. And it was Michelle was the first person to kind of highlight that to me. And when he highlighted it to me, I thought, geez, you're right. There's a lot of HIIT training out there that actually isn't HIIT. It's what Michelle calls HISS. It's high intensity, steady state, right? So if you go to a CrossFit or an F45, or you're doing sprint sessions where there's low recovery, or the type of training I do where I do high intensity resistance training, I'll do 30 seconds of work, 10 seconds of rest, then on to the next station, 30 seconds of work. When I actually look at your heart rate profile, it stays elevated throughout the workout, right? It's not coming down significantly. So it's dropping down a little bit in those rest periods, but not significant. So that's high intensity, steady state. And then you have the classic high intensity interval training, which came out of the research lab, which is you go 30 seconds all out on a bike, which is horrible, right? Or whatever piece of equipment, you're going 30 seconds to 60 seconds of full on 100% activity. And then you just turn your legs over for 2, 3, 4 minutes, right? And then you go again. And then you turn your legs over for 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, and then you go again. That's the true high intensity interval training. And there's similarities, but there are subtle differences between those things, right? So my recommendation is that everybody gets a pedometer, some type. You can buy a very cheap one all the way up to an Apple Watch or a fancy Garmin, and just make sure you're moving lots, right? There's this magic number of 10,000 steps, which actually isn't evidence-based. It came from a Japanese marketing campaign in the late 1960s. Our ancestors, not our ancestors, but hunter-gatherers and the Amish community, who are post-agricultural but pre-industrial, right? They don't drive cars. They both take between 15 and 20,000 steps a day, roughly, right? But if you can't get that amount, that's where the higher intensity stuff comes in. And I like to say to people, the other thing that isn't talked about anywhere enough is lifting heavy shit, right? Resistance training. I'm a big fan of that. It's some independent and complementary benefits to doing the more cardiovascular stuff. So I say to people, particularly as you get older, and people who are in our category, me and you, we are going through andropause, and most folks have not heard of andropause, right? It is the male menopause. And when you get to your mid to late 40s and certainly into your 50s, you get significant drops in growth hormone, testosterone, and DHEA, these really important anabolic hormones, right? And what I see in guys who are our age is most of them with a lot of their exercise, they're middle-aged men in Lycra, right? Mammals. They're out, they're riding bikes, and they're out for a couple of hours of a ride. And I think, yeah, that's good, but it's catabolic. It's actually breaking down muscle and that sort of stuff. That has to be complemented with anabolic exercise, which is resistance training, where you are stimulating the cells differently. You're actually creating muscle turnover. You're creating, laying down bone mineral density. You're adding some muscle, and that improves your insulin sensitivity and has a lot of independent benefits. So I think to basically cut that, make sure you move lots in terms of steps, do a bit of cardio, and you can talk about math if you want, and do some high intensity stuff, the odd bit of sprint stuff, and make sure you're lifting weights 2 or 3 times a week. That's what I would say is optimal.
Well, 100%. I think that's a great summary of where the field's at. And I think there's a few things on that, just that hormonal change, and especially for males, is something to really watch. For example, I don't have any trouble getting enough exercise because I've got a lifetime of it being my job, and it's a bit awkward if I don't really do it, and I like doing it. But I really do tend to make the mistake that you suggest there, which is head towards the aerobic stuff. Like this afternoon, I'm going to go out for a bike ride because want to get out of the house, and just get outside and do something, and it's an easy way to do that. But I've already written down in my diary that I'm going to do that easy ride around on the bike. It's mainly to clear the head, and I'm coming straight home. And I've got on the back deck, I've got some weights, including some reasonably decent ones, and I'm going to do some reasonably heavy things. Not that much of it, but just to do that, to stimulate that system. And I think I actually aspire to be more like you, Paul, with that, because I think you do a better job at mixing up those intensities than I do. I tend to head for the mammal. And that's the thing. And the other point that you made there, which is interesting with those steps, just to put those in perspective, that Amish study that you said, I think they averaged like 18,000 steps a day. It was the low season anyway. But what perked my interest in that paper, I think was, this is more than a decade old now, is that one Amish farmer got 51,000 steps in a day. I was like, holy, I'm sorry. And there's no exercise involved. It's just moving around. So I actually ran around then. I put my pedometer on, I ran the Auckland Marathon. And okay, fair enough, I didn't warm up much, but I still ran a whole marathon, and I sort of vaguely moved around for the rest of the day, and I got 39,000 steps. I was like, oh my God. It's like, I can't believe it. And anyway, so then we had this competition in my research lab, and I was like, oh, okay. And I was like, I'm going to take this guy, I'm going to take this Amish farmer. So I eventually did do it one day. I did 85,000 steps. And I'll tell you how I did it. I got up at the crack of dawn, and I ran what is a 4-day walk called the Hillary Trail, which is 90 kilometers. and I was so knackered. In fact, at one point, at about 70 kilometers into it, I gave up and I tried to call Louise to come pick me up, but there was no cell phone coverage. and I got 85,000 steps, but the average for the next 10 days meant that I was down to about 2,000 steps because I couldn't move again for the next 2 weeks. But just the sheer volume of how much people can accumulate on a working agricultural day is astonishing.
Yeah, and not just an agricultural day. It reminds me. I used to tell this story that there's a friend of mine called Sean who's a chef, but he had a couple of restaurants and he was a maitre d' in one, and he'd get up on a Saturday morning and he would go to the markets and buy all the food and then drop them off, and then he would come back and he'd be maitre d' for quite a busy restaurant for breakfast. And every Saturday he would then fly home from Sydney and he'd get home on a Saturday evening having done between 45 and 50,000 steps, right?
Wow.
Which is more than most Australians and Kiwis do in a week. Now, Sean can sit on his arse for the rest of Saturday and have a couple of beers, safe in the knowledge that he has had a net benefit day for his metabolism, right? That's the key thing. So I think the thing is to evaluate your lifestyle, right? And if you have an office job where you're sitting a lot, there's a number of things. The one that we didn't say I'm a big fan of is just set an alarm for every 30 minutes, get off your arse and do 30 seconds to a minute of high intensity exercise, whether it's push-ups, burpees. I've got a kettlebell sitting beside my desk, so I'll get up and I'll do kettlebell swings, which are friggin' awesome. So it's stimulating your metabolism to fire up, right? A lot of people don't realize the negative effect that prolonged sitting has on your gene expression, right? It changes your gene expression in very negative ways. It has a negative effect on your blood pressure, your brain function, and your overall metabolism. So I think that's the other thing that we need to remind the people is movement snacks, as I call them, is just have as many little movement snacks, break up that sitting as often as you can. And ideally, you would do it with a burst of high intensity exercise to get your blood flow and oxygen going.
Yeah, I used to think that was a good idea. Well, actually, I think that's a little bit unfair. I still think that's a massively good idea. What I reckon I've changed my mind on a bit in the last little while is how voluntary that is. And I'll tell you why. Like, we did all that standing desk stuff and we built them and put them in workplaces and that sort of thing. And the fundamental difference was, and this goes on with this other guy, Jim Levine in the US, his sort of work with the non-exercise activity thermogenesis stuff, is that some people, regardless of where you sit them, seem to spontaneously get up and just do this activity. And other people, you could basically prod them with a sharp stick and nothing happens. And my current theory with that is that it's a sort of combination of vagal nerve problems through high insulin and high leptin, so sort of insulin resistance. So I think for some people there's extra benefits of a bit more of a compressed eating window or the intermittent fasting stuff. If it just allows them to get glucose and insulin down. You see similar things. There's more evidence of this in pathological things. I think if you've ever watched that Robert Lustig, who's a pediatric endocrinologist from UCF, he would notice things with he'd have these kids that had for some reason or another had a lesion of their hypothalamus in the brain, right, the hunger center, right, and it's also around a sort of regulation of vagal nerve stimulation and stuff. And he would give them various drugs, but some would bring back some of that signaling, and he'd see them going from obese and unable to contain their hunger to being able to spontaneously moving more in the pattern that you see of metabolically healthy people. Is that they will, that for some spontaneous reason, they'll think it's a good idea to get a BVR or two. They'll get fidgety. I mean, I look at myself now, I'm just fidgeting with my pen. I'm itching to move. And I think part of that, in my opinion, is deeply metabolic around insulin resistance and that anabolic catabolic signaling. When you're in a growth anabolic phase, you don't want to move. When you can't see leptin,
Yeah.
in the mouse models, and we get a down regulation of that and a movement of nutrients where they shouldn't go. So that it sort of all connects up again. So there's also a dietary component. So I also favour longer exercise. If you're going to go and do it, I think the worst thing you can do is go and have a couple of honey sandwiches before you head out. I'd prefer to do those long, easy things fasted and just drive that process. And then the other stuff comes more naturally over the top of that. At least that's my current theory. I think it still needs to be proven.
Yeah. Now, I actually want to unpack it and explain that, because there was a whole heap of words that I know quite a lot of listeners will be going, Jesus, what did I say? Sounded impressive. But that whole anabolic state that you talked about and leptin. So leptin actually has a powerful effect on the brain on voluntary physical activity, right? So, and this is where sleep also comes into it, right? If you've had a shit sleep last night, your leptin is much lower. That means you're much more likely to sit on your arse all day long, and you're much less likely to do a workout, right? But as you're saying, when you're in that state of that anabolic state, where particularly your insulin is dysregulated, you got that high blood sugar, leptin is actually being reduced. And that means that there's a lower drive, a lower unconscious drive to actually move. That's where I think in those people who've become, and often we'll see, you see insulin resistance goes in concert with leptin resistance and glucocorticoid stress hormone resistance, right? So the feedback loops aren't working very well. And I think for those people, that's where they need those stimulus and those reminders of every 30 minutes to actually get up and do some movement. But also where that comes in for you, we'll talk about, actually we'll come back to this in a little bit. We'll come back to the nutrition part of things, because I wanted to talk on something that you had mentioned when we were just having a general discussion. You said, clearly comorbidities is a bad thing when it comes to COVID, right? You have any comorbidity, particularly a metabolic comorbidity like insulin resistance, overweight, insulin resistance, diabetes, overweight, those sorts of things. But one of the key things that they say, if you've got a comorbidity, stay inside, right? Don't interact with anybody, because if you get COVID, you're going to be screwed. One of the worst things that you can do is stay inside, right? Because there was a paper produced last year. It was an early paper that I talked about earlier on 185 patients, and it looked at vitamin D levels, and people with vitamin D deficiency, which is in our language, under 30. And in the United States, they have a different way of measuring it. They're nanograms per milliliter, under 12 for those guys. A 6-fold increase in severe disease and a 15-fold increase in death. Like, that is bonkers. I actually think down this part of the world, we have become, there's an unintended consequence of the whole slip, slap, slop campaign, because of the high cancer rates and the thin ozone layer. People just cover up all the time, and there's vitamin D deficiency levels the same in Australia and New Zealand as there is in Northern Ireland and Scotland, which is completely bonkers because there's no sun in Northern Ireland and the north of Scotland, right? And this for me is a really important thing that you can fix quite easily. Now, as well as that paper, there's been 14 observational studies to date showing an inverse correlation between vitamin D and severity of disease, right? So it's not an isolated paper. We know that vitamin D is a really powerful epigenetic regulator, right? It affects more than 2,500 genes in your body, right? It's hugely important for your immune system. It lowers inflammation. It has an impact on cancer, diabetes, respiratory tract infections, multiple sclerosis. And we see that Hispanics and African Americans have worse outcomes with vitamin D because that darker skin, they have lower levels of vitamin D, right? Now, there's currently at least 50 clinical trials going on vitamin D and COVID. but most of them are about treatment. There's only 4 of them that are happening right now on prevention. And I think it's a hugely important thing that we can do. Now, we'll get to the recommendations later, but I just wanted your comments on vitamin D and what you feel about the importance of it. Is there anything that I've missed on it?
Yeah, well, I think you make some great points there. And the one that's always staggered me, having lived in Queensland in Australia for a decade, is that has equal vitamin D deficiency as everywhere else. A third of people in deficiency. How that's even possible is utterly beyond me. And I think you're right. It's an over response to the slap, and no one wants to get melanoma and these sorts of things. But we're talking about not getting sunburnt here. So sunburnt is a very different thing than getting plenty of sun and the benefits that confers. And so I think we need to change our thinking on that. Activity outside is important. To me, the most important. You're right, and there's thousands of reasons. Most of them probably not fully understood why vitamin D could be crucial. But to me, one of the most important ones is that vitamin D acts in a hormonal role at the glucose transporter and upregulates glucose metabolism. That's huge, and massive. And the second one is that the proof of vitamin D, enough of it, plus also the supplementation of it orally. First of all, the oral supplementation was really designed around a lot of work that was going on around bone health and fragility of bones and these sorts of things. And actually, frankly, the oral supplementation results were very disappointing. Yeah. But the results aren't disappointing with immune function and viral disease. They're astonishingly good. And then you start to add to that other trace elements like zinc, and these sorts of things, and you seem to see an additional benefit of doing that as well. So I think those are really exciting things, a sort of concoction of vitamin D, perhaps some vitamin C, and probably some zinc.
I would add selenium into that.
Yes.
With respiratory tract infections. And the one other thing I would add as well is vitamin D. Vitamin D, zinc, selenium would be omega-3 fatty acids because they're anti-inflammatory, right? Good quality, a really good quality fish oil, I think is important. And then, you go.
Well, I guess, that's the other thing about omega-3s, that was all heart health.
Yeah.
And frankly, it was disappointing.
Yes. Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that it's out. Actually, it turns out to be much more effective for that immune function and things like brain health. Turn out to be and its antidepressive effects and prevention of mood problems. So you've got a concoction there.
To your point, Grant, like 10% of your brain's weight is omega-3 fatty acids. Like when we think about that, it is bloody important. Now, some of the reason why some of those clinical trials have been disappointing is the ratio of EPA to DHA, also the quality of it, the amount of time that people had been on it, how much omega-6 was in their actual diet, because the omega-3, omega-6 ratio is really important as well. So there's a number of factors that go into it. But I think when we're talking about metabolic health and around COVID, I think it's a definite on the in list. Now, I had mentioned around the vitamin D, how much to actually take. Some people are concerned about vitamin D toxicity. It's extremely rare, we would say, first and foremost, and particularly in this part of the world. So if you are concerned about it, go and see your doctor. But if you have diabetes and you don't get a lot of sun, and your doctor's open to this sort of stuff, I would recommend getting your levels checked. If it's low, an infusion is the best way to get that up. But for normal...
Oh, how does that work?
Oh, they could just bang it straight into you. So you can actually get an infusion and you'll get... it's like, if you're iron deficient, which my wife Quali had a bit of a problem with iron, and because she's got some carrier gene that she thought I need to reduce my iron, but actually didn't, and ended up with low iron. But an infusion is much faster acting than taking tablets, right? Taking tablets takes 6 weeks, infusion takes a couple of days, right? But for the everyday where an infusion isn't on the table, I recommend the 3,000 to 5,000 IUs per day. And at least a minimum, if you're worried about high levels, a minimum of 1,000 IUs, and getting out into the sun for 20 minutes, right? And in terms of the zinc and the selenium, I think you can just get those normal levels. You just take any standard supplement of those would actually do. And the fish oil, at least 3 milligrams, so 3 tablets of the fish oil. But if I will often recommend to people that if they have a problem with either depression or they've got a problem with diabetes or any of those are metabolic problems, 5 to 6 of those tablets a day, and get the really good quality stuff. The one that I take, pure omega-3, and it's a Kiwi guy actually, called Graham, and he imports it from Canada. It's screened for over 10,000 toxins. I've got no financial relationship whatsoever. I just think it's a great product. PUR, no, there's no E, PUR omega3.com.au or .co.nz, where you guys are. Now let's jump on to food and diet in general. We've only got a couple of minutes. So quickly about inflammation and an anti-inflammatory diet. So what are your recommendations, Grant?
Well, and this is the first time I should be publicly saying this, a decade on from copying you, putting it out in 5 minutes. And rule number 1 of my usual 10 rules that I'll have in most of my What the Fat and What the Face and What the Fast and all these books is go low HI. And I think I borrowed this. When I say it's if you take the idea of one person, it's plagiarism. If you take it off many, it's research.
That's right.
So unfortunately, it's in the first category. So, I heard you talking about low human interference, and it really resonated with me that as a template for whole food. And I think whole food from plants and animals that were recently alive in nature somewhere, it's going to be naturally high in nutrients, but also I think relatively low in glycemic load. Therefore, it's not going to have that strong effect on glucose and insulin that we've been talking about. So that's my template. So thank you.
Yep. Oh, good. No, happy with that. And look, the other thing I would add to this, and it's kind of covered in that low HI diet, right, is to just minimize inflammatory foods. And what a lot of people don't realize is that processed high glycemic carbohydrates and sugar, they both drive something you mentioned earlier on, age glycation end products, which are very, very pro-inflammatory at a cellular level, right? So just get off the junk carbs, the bloody breakfast cereals, the breads, the pastries, the donuts, and the biscuits. Just kick all that stuff into touch. Eat stuff that has been alive and minimally interfered with by humans. Drink plenty of water and have a little bit of alcohol every now and then. And it doesn't need to be more complicated than that, does it?
No, and there's a lot of discussion, and I've been part of that over the years about, so can I do, what happens if I do a keto diet? What if I do this? What if I do that?
Yeah.
Different amounts. But, in reality, that on a whole food template, that actually just takes care of itself. It's all sorted. And you might need some, just like with fitness, you might need a little bit more personalization if you've got diabetes and that sort of thing, a little bit more careful about the types of carbohydrate containing food that you might have. You'd be a little bit more restrictive. Those are in the context of a whole food that are actually relatively minor. And I think there's a lot of argument, and nutrition is a very divided set of communities with a lot of different beliefs in them. And I think that's unfortunate, really.
Yeah. And look, guys, I think I would finish this. I'm going to plug your website, Precure, because you've got a 21-day, have you got a 21-day plan on low carb eating, on low carb keto? So, here's my strong recommendation to people. If you are overweight with what's called central obesity, so if most of your weight is around your stomach and or you have high blood sugar or diabetes, go and do that 21-day plan, and I guarantee you it'll have a significant effect on your overall health, and will have a really massive impact, particularly if you then bring in the physical activity and the vitamin D, the zinc, the selenium, and the omega-3 fatty acids, all that stuff that we talked about. Doing all of that will have a huge impact on your ability for your body to fight off COVID when you get it, because
you will get it.
You will get it. I think that's the take out of this. You will get it. So in conjunction with getting the vaccine, prepare your body's defenses. And the best way you can prepare your body's defenses is do lots of physical activity, get out into the sun, maybe even take a vitamin D capsule, get on those supplements that we mentioned, and eat a low HI diet. And if you have diabetes, pre-diabetes, or a big tummy, jump on to precure.co.nz and do that 20-day plan. Or precure.com and jump on that 20-day plan. Anything to add? Something I'll summarize?
Well, I've run my whole life doing 3-week challenges because I think it suits most people's psyches, including my own. Yeah. It's like, can I do anything forever? No. Can I go up for 3 weeks and do it pretty well? Yeah. Mostly.
I agree.
So, yeah, that's how I do it.
Awesome. Grant, this has been very cool. I think very important for people, given that we are all going to catch COVID. So, forewarned is forearmed. Arm yourself, and off you go.
All right. Thanks, Paul. I really appreciate you coming on as well. So that's great.
Thanks, mate. Cheers.